Welcome. My name is Mark Scapens, and I am the director ad interim of the School of Visual Arts. This evening's lecture is being recorded and live streamed. To begin, I would like to express a huge thank you to the Jewish Cultural Endowment, whose generous support is funding this evening's programming. This is an exciting moment for telling the history of our school, the School of Visual Arts here at BU. We are so fortunate to not only host Dr. Ben Street and Professor Dana Clancy this evening to relate a chapter of Philip Guston's work at Boston University, but also to have the Museum of Fine Arts currently featuring the work of another former School of Visual Arts faculty member, John Wilson. That exhibition, titled Witnessing Humanity, The Art of John Wilson, features a zine made by our MFA in Visual Narrative students and will be traveling to the Metropolitan Museum in New York following its run here in Boston. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to share the legacy of important teachers and artists who have been a part of our community and played important roles in developing our school's identity. Speaking of people who have played important roles in developing our school's identity, I would like to introduce Professor Dana Clancy. Professor Clancy is an associate professor of art in painting at the School of Visual Arts and most recently served as the director of the school for 6 years. I cannot share enough in these brief remarks to detail the extent of Professor Clancy's impactful leadership during that time. Under her steadfast direction, the school successfully weathered some of its greatest storms, including the global pandemic, as well as underwent its greatest curricular expansion in decades. With Professor Clancy's leadership, SVA added 2 new graduate degrees, the MFA in Visual Narrative and the MFA in Print, Media, and Photography, as well as the addition of a new undergraduate degree, the Bachelor of Arts. Professor Clancy's imprint is experienced in every aspect of what we do as members of this community. Her dedicated service to SVA, her efforts to make the arts more visible on campus, nurturing connections in Boston's art community and internationally, and her contributions to connecting and supporting our alums, students, staff, and faculty have left very big shoes to fill. She is a visual arts and design champion, and her impactful work and leadership have left SVA better off and on a track for continued success. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clancy.
Thank you so much, Mark. You are definitely filling the shoes, and then some. It's great to be here. And I'm on sabbatical this year, but it is such a sincere pleasure to welcome Dr. Ben Street to Boston University for this lecture. And I'm just so happy to see you all tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. Dr. Street's lecture tonight is informed by his extensive doctoral research at University of East Anglia. Tonight, he will shine more light on the importance of the Boston context on Philip Guston's groundbreaking last decade of painting, and share research and insights into the impact of travel to Italy on Guston's late work. Philip Guston's most prolific last decade of painting coincided with a period of strong ties to Boston University, the result of established relationships with founding faculty, members, and previous visits or invitations to campus. Alumni here this evening or listening via live stream may, as students, have heard Guston's important 1966 lecture in which he discussed preoccupations in the studio revealed only later in the 1970 Marlborough Gallery exhibition that launched a new chapter in his work, to say the least. Prior to that show, In May, oh, sorry, should change this. Logan told me in March 1970, Guston was on campus to receive an honorary degree. There was not a graduation in 1970, a ceremony. So I think those are some important things to think about as Guston's coming to campus in 1970 for an honorary degree. Because of all of the unrest, there was no graduation ceremony. So he received his honorary degree early in March of 1970. Sorry. And I think that must have meant a lot to someone who did not finish his arts high school for interesting reasons. I won't go into the story, or receive a college degree. To receive an honorary degree from Boston University at that time, I have to think, meant a lot to Guston and really forged a long relationship until the end of his life in 1980. In the fall of 1970, the Marlborough work traveled immediately after to the Boston University Art Galleries, with Guston working closely with then chairman, Professor Emeritus Sidney Hurwitz, who is here tonight. By 1973, Guston was consistently on campus as part of the select cohort of faculty teaching at the University Professors Program, thanks to advocacy by founding BU Visual Arts chair and painting faculty member David Aronson, whose links to Guston apparently went back to meeting while they were both in Italy in 1948. There's just a really long relationship there. I think it's really exciting for the school. Guston taught at BU School of Visual Arts, then the Division of Art in the School of Fine and Applied Arts until 1978. And even after that, he'd established a traveling scholarship, which only happened once due to his death, but Bruce Herman, who received that scholarship, was here tonight as well. Before we hear from Ben Street, I'd like to add a little personal context for my own engagement with Guston, starting 30 years ago with exhibitions of his late elusive and very powerful paintings at McKee Gallery in New York, where I was a student at the New York Studio School, where Guston also taught and where there was a studio named after him prior to my time. I seem to have followed a Guston path to BU, where I am now Associate Professor of Painting, reflecting on my ongoing connections to the artist's work and my changing understanding of it through new exhibitions and new scholarship and a changing context of the world as well, allows me to acknowledge the impact of other people at BU on my understanding of Guston. At BU, Professor Emeritus Patricia Hills, Professor Kim Sitchell, and former BU Art Galleries Director John Stomberg impacted how I understood and later taught about Guston's work. In 2018, when I became the school director, during my first week in the role, SVA Operations Manager Logan Zimmerman, who is here, he welcomed me to administration in the best way possible. He brought in a beautiful, organized box of all of the Guston correspondence and cards and posters and his hand. And that really meant a lot to me and really kind of started, it energized me so much as director to really connect with our past in all different ways and with our alumni as well, which I really appreciated it. We also later shared those materials with the Boston MFA curators for the Philip Guston Now show, and they included some of that information in the 2022 vitrine in the show. The ability to reflect on important artistic legacies at SVA would not be possible without Logan's consistent, careful, knowledgeable commitment to this history, including his contributions to the grant we received for this talk from the Jewish Cultural Endowment. I'm especially grateful as well to the JCE for their support and to Teresa Cooney and Dr. Nancy Horowitz for selecting this lecture during the 2024 grant cycle. I also want to especially acknowledge my gratitude to Sidney Hurwitz, who shared his direct and extensive experiences working with Guston on his BU exhibitions, starting, I think, in fall of 19. We had lunch together before the pandemic and showing drawings, Guston's drawings, and there's just so many different conversations that I kept with me, and I feel so grateful to know about. It's also you shared your great stories about leadership challenges. I have to tell you. That was really helpful too. It is also wonderful to have so many alumni here tonight. I was grateful to alumni from the 1970s who have shared their stories of learning from Guston with me and with the MFA Boston. So those conversations really inform how I think more directly about him, both as an artist and as a teacher. The Philip Guston Now exhibition was the occasion for meeting Ben Street when he made a research visit to campus to review those same archival materials. But his reputation preceded him. As in your pamphlet, Ben lectures and writes extensively and eloquently about art. He has published many books for general readers with art publisher Phaidon, and written exhibition catalogs for Saatchi Gallery, Lisson Gallery, and Royal Academy of Art, among others. Ben is very easy to connect with, given his depth and breadth of knowledge and passion for talking about art, paired with a wonderful sense of humor. I really appreciated being able to represent Guston's role at BU on a panel he organized in London in 2023 for Freelands Foundation. He has also been a lecturer and educator for many museums in the UK and US, including the National Gallery, Royal Academy in London, and the Museum of Modern Art and Guggenheim in New York. His books for general readership include How to Enjoy Art, published by Yale, and the award-winning children's book, How to Be an Art Rebel, which I love that title, published by Thames and Hudson. He is currently a tutor at University of Oxford and the University of East Anglia. Ben consistently travels to Italy to research and teach close looking at art in situ, or contemporary art, whether contemporary art at the Venice Biennale or historical Italian paintings and frescoes. And I'm especially excited to hear Dr. Street unpack Philip Guston's 1974 BU Art Gallery show in relation to Guston's studio dialogues with a pantheon of Italian painters, and specifically with early Renaissance frescoes. Having taught for BU study abroad near Florence and in Venice, as well as traveling there for my research exhibitions, it really will mean a lot to me to hear more. We just talk a lot about that whenever we see each other. So I would like to end by acknowledging the students in the room. So thank you, students, for coming out, faculty from BU who are here, and thanking MFA Graphic Design student Rachel Kafua for designing the beautiful poster, booklet, and outreach materials, and for the leadership of Programming and Media Manager Narissa Cooney toward welcoming you all here tonight. Thank you all for being here. I hope that after the 1-hour lecture, you will remain for 15 to 20 minutes of questions and conversation with Ben. I will help moderate that. And I'm really grateful to Mark for your leadership and so much support for this lecture, for the Howard Thurman Center, the College of Fine Arts, Donor Alumni Relations, and the School of Visual Arts for their help, care, and engagement. And most of all, my sincere thanks to Ben for your thought-provoking writing and scholarship. And I turn it over to you for your wonderful lecture ahead. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah. Oh, wow. Well, oh, yeah, good, all right. Well, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to do very, very quick, just a couple of people. Thank you, because I want to get right into it. Thank you very much. First of all, Kate Neeson, I know she's not here, but she was one of the curators for the Philip Guston Now show, who put me in touch with Dana in the first place, and through Dana I met Logan, a national treasure, as far as I'm concerned. Mark Scapens, thank you so much. Narissa, thank you so much. Wherever you are, thank you. I don't want to bury the lead with this, so I want to start right away with what my basic outline is when talking about Guston in Boston, which is that I think the context of Boston as a place of exhibition and a place of practice and a place of education has been somewhat under-discussed in the literature on this artist. I think the context of Boston changes in a really interesting way, the way we see and think about Guston's late work. And what I want to do is convince you, or attempt to convince you of that as I go through the course of this lecture, which is going to be, I'm just going to speak. I'm not going to read from notes, because I am still, despite having spent 4 years writing this behemoth thesis, which is unreadable, don't read it, I'm going to try and tidy it up, despite all of that, my thoughts on this artist, and indeed on all artists, are continually evolving. So that's why I've decided to do it in this particular kind of way. let's go right into what we're talking about. This is a letter written by Guston to friends of his in Florida who were collectors, called the Hyams family. And he wrote this in 1973. And I think this is a wonderful way in to thinking about Guston in Boston. I am on a Boston kick. I go there once a month to teach, and I enjoy it a lot. The teaching is, this is very revealing, the teaching is slight, and we spend 2 or 3 days just looking around. Old trolley cars, movies, fish restaurants, museums, and so on. Not bad. Really the way NYC used to be years ago, and which I detest now. I hardly ever go in and feel out of things there. So, Boston seemingly provided for Guston some sort of way of time traveling, some way of going back to his golden years maybe of the 1930s and 40s in New York, of the New York School. So this, I thought, was a very interesting document, a very interesting way of thinking about Guston. What was it about Boston that made him think this, and what was the result in his work? I mean, what I'm going to do really is divide this into 2 halves. The first half of this is about just presenting this idea about Guston in Boston, why I think it is significant. And then the second half of it, it's not going to go on for hours and hours. The second half of it, I'm going to talk about the 1974 exhibition at BU, which I think is a really significant part of Guston's work, which has been under-discussed. What has been over-discussed, by comparison, is this exhibition. In fact, I go one step further. I'd say not just this exhibition, but the opening night of this exhibition. So that, I think, is very pivotal. This is the exhibition which many of you, I see from people nodding, and I think maybe many of you recognize what this is as a historical moment in Guston's career, which is the moment in which his work, his late figurative work, which he was producing from about 1968, was first shown to the public in a public forum, which was the Marlborough Gallery in New York. It's a legendary moment. It's one of those things in the history of art where you have these exhibitions, like the first Impressionist exhibition, which is something that slightly shifts or breaks the mold or transforms the way an artist's work is understood. This is his exhibition in Marlborough Gallery in New York in October 1970. On the left-hand side, you're seeing this painting called The Studio, which has, in a sense, become the emblematic late Guston painting. In fact, it's so much the case. I mean, there's a great book. I can recommend you lots of good reading on Guston. There's a great book by Craig Burnett. He wrote a book which is published by MIT Press, which is just about this painting. And there's so much to say that even at the end of this book, you think he could have added 3 or 4 additional chapters. I would say not only has this painting become kind of symbolic of this late work of Guston, it's like the whole of his career, in a way, has been collapsed around a single point in time, a single body of work, a single group of paintings. And these are paintings which, in this Marlborough exhibition, almost all of them showed images that have been interpreted as images of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, that is not something that is universally understood or universally held to be true. And it's something that he himself actually shifted his position on continually. Regardless, I think we can generally understand them to be perhaps alluding, at least, if not specifically to the Klan, but alluding to a kind of evil, dark, pernicious cultural icon, a cultural figure that he seems to occupy in this painting. He seems to play act the role of somebody who would have wanted somebody like him dead. So this is not what I'm here to talk about, actually, at all. Because this exhibition, which was in New York in 1970, well, let's talk a tiny bit more about it, because I have got another slide, which is this. It's again like this thing of these exhibitions that are mold breakers. It was largely badly received. Not entirely badly received. There's a very interesting Village Voice review of it, which does seem to acknowledge actually what kinds of things are happening in these paintings of Guston, but for the most part, it seems as though people did not like it. That's a wonderful photograph you can see on the bottom right corner, which is Guston. He's in his 50s. He's having a conversation with Willem de Kooning, who is one of the very few artists of the New York School generation who seemed to see what Guston was doing, if not actually like it. But generally speaking, when you hear anecdotes about what the opening was like, a lot of it is about embarrassment, or what we might now call cringe. There are people who didn't want to talk to him. He talked, or somebody, with these anecdotes bob around in your head. There was a dinner after the opening at a Chinese restaurant, and Guston or somebody said that no one mentioned the show once. It's like somebody coming to your gig, you've got your new band, and you show, it's like, what do you think of the music? It's like, isn't the food great in here? It's that kind of thing. It was embarrassing. And the really important, I think, pivotal, bad critical review of it was this one by Robert Hughes, where he talked about the fact that the paintings seemed to be out of time or anachronistic. It may seem a little late in the century to mount an entire exhibition on the theme of the Ku Klux Klan, but that's what he has done. And Robert Hughes changed his mind about Guston famously and wrote about that later on. But the really famous review is Hilton Kramer writing in the New York Times, saying with this, I think, a beautiful headline, "A Mandarin pretending to be a stumblebum." And that can be condensed in modern language into this is pretentious, in a way, I would say. This is somebody who has an authentic voice as an abstract painter and is doing something we know to be phony, inauthentic. It's calling him out, in a sense. That's New York. This is Boston, because the exhibition didn't stay in New York. The week after, it traveled to Boston University. And when it went to Boston University, the exhibition, which consisted almost entirely of the same body of paintings, there are a couple that didn't travel, but the studio was there, the one I showed you before, and this amazing painting called City Limit, which is at MoMA now, was also there. It was received very differently by Boston critics. This is Edgar J. Driscoll writing in the Boston Globe. He said, "Not only has Guston returned to the figurative, but to an art of political message as well, and he does it in a most engaging fashion via the comic strip route, although there's nothing funny about the things of which he speaks." Really perceptive review of paintings that were, and are, I think to some extent even today, quite startling and even quite shocking things to contemplate. These particular ones, I think, retain that kind of power to provoke and upset. This is a letter that Guston wrote to Sydney saying, "BU made me feel like a prince." So this is two very, very different reception histories of these notorious paintings of Guston's. One of them is a mostly rejection. The other one is a grudging, slightly surprised or bewildered, but nevertheless positive response. So the question becomes, why is it that Boston became a context in which Guston's late figuration might be embraced or better understood? This is something that Dana alluded to or spoke of in her introduction. Wonderful photograph on the left-hand side of Guston receiving his honorary doctorate from BU with his hat on, looking very pleased, I think, in March 1970. As Dana said, this was his only, he didn't graduate high school, I don't think, so this was his only kind of university endorsement that he got, and it was very important to him. And on the right-hand side, this extraordinary drawing, which I was not aware of. And when I came to Boston in 2022 and was given access to the archive at BU, I was amazed to see it, because it's a Guston life drawing made sometime in the 1970s. I don't think we can confidently date it yet, but it's a drawing that looks very unlike the kinds of paintings he was making at the time, but it shows you that he's somebody who's plugged in to a kind of tradition of life drawing, which is something that was very much unfashionable among the artists of his generation in New York and elsewhere at the time. To me, it looks kind of mannerist. It looks a little bit like Tintoretto's drawings, if you know those, that are very muscular but sort of slightly detached and with this very, very expressive line. I mean, the line is really his line. You know, when you see the line, the kind of contour, you can see, oh yeah, there's a sort of stuttering line that he does. There's a kind of strange, it's a bit like Cézanne, there's a kind of strange, uncertain, doubled line he does in his paintings and drawings, but I think it's there in this life drawing as well. I am here to talk about Guston, But of course, what's important is the context of artists who were already here as well. So when I looked at that life drawing, it also made me think of an artist like Hyman Bloom, who's clearly somebody who is working in well, he wasn't initially, but working at this point in a figurative mode, something that is very evidently, with that amazing life drawing on the right-hand side, not life drawing, perhaps life drawing, but nevertheless drawing on the right-hand side, which is got an extraordinary grasp of a traditional technique of drawing. I mean, again, it could be something that was plucked out of the 16th century or 17th century. But again, with these really, I think, remarkable paintings by Bloom of these cadavers that some of you may well know because he had the show at the MFA. These very grotesque, quite unsettling, abject, one would say, representations of the body that are, again, I mean, interestingly enough, Hyman Bloom had a joint exhibition with Francis Bacon, and somebody who I think actually there's a great sort of simpatico thing going on there between the two of them. But regardless, there is a context here which maybe you might say parallels artists working in Chicago or artists working in San Francisco perhaps at the same time. There's a context here of artists who are devoted to, dedicated to representations of the figure, but they are not conventional. They don't look dusty, old-fashioned. They seem contemporary, but they are still dedicated to those particular kinds of ways of making. I mean, this is Guston. This is a later Guston. I want to make sure that I get this right, this bit. Yeah, we go. So Bloom, as many of you will know, grew up in what we now call Latvia, which was then called the Russian Empire. And he was born the same year as Guston in 1913. He speaks of seeing Cossacks, Tsarist Cossacks, and he literally grew up in a shtetl. So he saw these Cossacks rampaging through the countryside. Now, that vision of these mounted Tsarist soldiers is something that would, I am sure, have sparked off something quite exciting in Guston. Guston was a very literary man, as I'm sure many of you know. He was a great reader. He was a huge fan of the writings of Isaac Babel, which if you haven't read, I recommend strongly you read. This is a wonderful writer. Red Cavalry is written in 1926, group of stories. He was killed by Stalin. The work was published in the USA in 1955 with this introduction by Lionel Trilling, which Guston had a copy of and certainly knew. And the Red Cavalry stories are both horrifying, violent, and funny. They have this amazing comedy, very dark comedy, and they're full of very shocking things. It's honestly, an amazing thing to read. They are startling stories, and they're stories, they're short. So this is Guston's painting from 1977 called To I.B., To Isaac Babel, that he's dedicating to Babel, and there's a sort of horse-like figure that's it's as though it's stampeding past a pile of dismembered limbs and body parts, which feels very of Babel's imaginative world, I would say. But it's also interesting that to triangulate this, you have Hyman Bloom, who had first-hand memory of actually seeing the kinds of things that Babel talked about in his stories. There's a way in which, I guess what I'm getting at, there's a way in which Guston, who was a second-generation migrant to Canada, he was born in 1913 in Montreal. His parents were from, well, where were his parents from? I mean, he believed that his parents were from Odessa. And Odessa was where Isaac Babel was from. And one might say that it might be slightly willed, this thing of his parents come from Odessa. There's some research that's been done quite recently by Harry Cooper, who was the curator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, who said that it seems likely that his parents maybe got married. This is in the weeds, I know. But, it seems like his parents were married in Odessa, but were perhaps from Poland. The point is that Guston saw Odessa as his spiritual homeland, thanks to Babel. And I do believe that this exposure to artists who were first-generation migrants to the States was very important for Guston's sense of his own identity, because what's at stake in Guston's late paintings is his own identity as a person, his own identity as a Jewish man, his own identity as an American, and his own identity as a painter of figurative art. Those are all ideas that are, I think, whipped up by, swept up by the experience of Boston. Let me have a gulp of water. As you can hear, I'm chatty. This is probably why I like Guston so much. Boston painters, Boston Expressionist painters, use techniques that we might associate not just necessarily with old master painting, but with traditional forms of artistic practice. Here are two paintings, both made in encaustic. Now, encaustic, maybe within the annals of 20th century art history, we might associate encaustic. This is a Boston audience. I'm being very careful with what I say here. We might associate with something like Jasper Johns, or at least I would say, oh, Jasper Johns, the flag paintings are encaustic with collage. But this is encaustic from earlier. Encaustic is something you see in very ancient paintings. This is Esther Geller on the left-hand side, and then Carl Zerber, a really significant figure in the museum school. But again, I'm not here to tell the story of Boston Expressionism. I'm simply here to talk about Guston in relation to these artists. There are artists who are making use of traditional techniques that were very outside of the dominant currents of contemporary art in the 1960s and 70s, like very much so. I think personally, actually, the really critical, pivotal figure is David Aronson. And the reason I think that is not really because of what his work looks like. And I think that's a key thing, because Guston's work actually doesn't strongly resemble the work of the Boston painters. But I think kind of technically and spiritually, there's a great kinship between them and him. This is David Aronson's painting, The Golem or The Golem. I'm going to say Golem, which I think is maybe the British pronunciation. Oh, sorry. Golem. I'm going to say Golem, and you can translate that in your heads. That's Golem, Aronson's painting Golem from the 1950s, which is also encaustic again, which is, and the Golem is, of course, this famous narrative from Jewish folklore, set in, sort of Prague maybe is the sort of home of that story. It's been much discussed. It's a story about creation. It's a story about hubris. It's a story about physical strength. I mean, there's so much happening in that story, which has undergone all kinds of permutations culturally over the 20th century. That is Aronson on the left-hand side, where there is a golem or a golem being brought to life out of what looks a little bit like a grave, or I think a picture, a painting, a picture frame. It's like a painting being brought to life. And the golem or the golem becomes a really important symbol of what Guston's paintings are doing, I think, which is that they are, to some extent, dragging up the clay and the mud and the dirt of the past and making it come to life, which is that's what the golem is. On the right-hand side, there's his painting, which is in the 1974 exhibition, the golem, the clansman becoming something else, becoming a different kind of figure, something which is not an aggressive figure like a clansman, but protector figure, this is where the ambivalence, the wonderful ambivalence of Guston's late work really comes in. Another thing about Aronson, this is Guston writing about Aronson in 1978, in this catalogue for an exhibition that was at the Rose Art Museum and then went to the Jewish Museum in New York. There's a longer essay here. It's quite a short essay, but I just wanted to hone in on one sentence. David Aronson caused me to remember and made me a witness too. This is Guston in 1978. He's looking back over a period of time when he knows Aronson. He met him, we think, in the 1940s in Italy. He's been in his life, in other words, for many, many years by the time he writes this. He made me a witness too. What did he make a witness to? What is he witnessing? I think in a way what he's witnessing is his own identity, his own Jewishness, and that is at stake in a lot of Guston's late work. It's at stake broadly in the very idea of representational art, of course. The very idea of representing something is something that contravenes the second commandment. So we have something where the issue of representation becomes particularly charged. The volume is particularly turned up in the work of these artists. Now, I just want to make that very clear, that it's not that Guston is making work like these artists, it's that the very sort of spiritual notions that underpin them, the ideas that are within them, that are boiling within them, are incredibly important to his work too. End of part one. This is part two. Now, I know what's happening. I can feel my face changing as it does an impression of a Guston painting, getting pinker and pinker and pinker as we go along. It's just the way it is. You'll have to live with it. 1974. 1970 is the Marlborough exhibition, which comes here. The next exhibition he has is 1974. There's a long gap, in other words. A lot happens in that gap. In 1974, he is now on staff. He's a visiting professor at BU. He comes to Boston once a month for maybe 2 or 3 nights, and he's very involved in the department at BU. There are people in this room, and I'm honored to be in this room with these people, who were taught by him, who have first-hand knowledge of what that was like. I'm very jealous, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about that. This exhibition has been hardly discussed. There's a wonderful catalogue. There's from the 90s, Kim Sickle and Mary Drack McGuinness, wonderful essays in that publication for the BU show. But in the more recent catalogues of Guston, it's been overlooked. I think it's very important. This is the show. It's called Philip Guston New Paintings. And it took place in 1974 across the street. I was struck in fact, it was Logan who pointed this out, when I first saw that space, I was struck by the fact that it was an unconventional gallery space, that it's vaulted. And it's vaulted in this amazing, I'm sure many of you will know these, it's got these fantastic capitals with all of these kind of people with wrenches and spanners and things, and it was a Buick showroom. So it's a brilliant, like, sort of American industrial take on the Romanesque. It feels not like a gallery at all. In fact, it feels a little bit like a religious site. And that actually is really important for what I want to say about why that exhibition matters. In fact, I've preempted myself with this line from Robert Taylor, reviewing the show in the Boston Globe, and he said it was the best show of the year in 1974. He said, one could easily write about the paintings in terms of art history. If it didn't wander too far afield, I think an essay could trace their connection to the Renaissance, particularly to Piero della Francesca. I took that as a kind of dare when I read that. I thought, I could go far afield. Yeah, I could do it. And I think wandering too far afield is the appeal of the subject. This is a letter Guston wrote in 1973 to Maya Shapiro, who he was good friends with, of course, very significant thinker and writer. He writes to Maya Shapiro in 1973, as the paintings that will be shown in Boston are being completed. I have stayed close to the studio this year, and a group of large pictures are the result. They stimulate me and lead me on and on. It is as if there is a plot, both in subject and plastic structure, unknown to me, but revealed as I go from painting to painting. There's a painting that's in the show called The Hill, and it's a painting that is very specifically his environment. The environment of Woodstock, his mailbox with his number on the mailbox, very specific. The paintings that are on show in that 1974 exhibition trace, I think, the boundaries of a world, like an imaginative world. You see beds and bedrooms, you see views outside windows and landscape. It's very close. Whereas the 1970 show, there's cities, there's lots of different kinds of landscapes in them. It's much more exploratory. This feels much more internal, but I'll explore that as we go along. My whole interest in Guston began with this painting, which is an extraordinary thing called Pantheon. Pantheon is quite a small painting that Guston made in 1973, in the middle of making the paintings that he would show in 1974, of course. So this is like a slice, a view into his mind. These are the artists that mattered to him, yes, throughout his career, but especially then. I think they're artists that were really meaningful to what he did in 1974. What is this strange thing? Such a strange painting. Masaccio, Piero, ... because I don't think there was room to fit the whole name in. It's Piero della Francesca. I do think that's what it is, I do really. Giotto, and then Tiepolo with 2 lines underneath it, which we were talking about this, Dana. I think when he uses Tiepolo, he's talking about both father and son, Tiepolo. And then right in the corner, like a signature, like as though he's playing a part to Chirico, the only living artist on the list, and the only artist who's known predominantly for easel painting. The other artists are known predominantly for fresco. So what's on his mind when he makes this painting, when he makes the 1974 paintings, is, I think, fresco painting. Fresco painting as a public art form. I think the thing that is very important to him when he makes these paintings, when the show is installed, is the idea of painting's public address. And that's something that you get from encounters with works in situ. Because what had happened between 1970 and 1974 is that he took his last trip to Italy. It was his fourth trip to Europe, his third trip to Italy. Many of the sites he saw, he was revisiting. That's a wonderful photograph of Guston and his wife, the great poet Musa McKim, standing outside Santa Maria Novella, the church in Florence. The photograph on the right-hand side is a photograph of the Brancacci Chapel. Got the wonderful frescoes by Masaccio and Mazzolino and Filippi. And that's a photograph taken probably in the 1950s. But I'm showing it to you because I want you to see that the artworks he saw were in a very poor state of repair when he saw them. And I think that's meaningful. Guston was obsessed with Piero. He was obsessed with Masaccio. But I wanted to know, what were those artists like for him at the time? What was it like to go to Florence in 1970 and see these frescoes? None of them had been restored. All of them were restored at the end of the 80s or into the 2000s. So if you go now and see the Brancacci Chapel, or you go to see Piero, or indeed the Sistine Chapel, they look fresh as a daisy. But they did not look fresh as a daisy in 1970. In 1970, they looked grimy. Not only did they look grimy, Florence, 4 years previously, had suffered from a devastating flood, which was a horrifying thing, where innumerable manuscripts, books, and documents were destroyed, but also many artworks. Frescoes had to be removed and remounted onto canvas. A lot of artworks were lost. So he was encountering these things. Now, this is almost a by the by. I've got a whole chapter in my thesis about this. But that Guston encountered artworks that were in a state of damage or a state of decay, and that's meaningful for the way he makes his own work. But I just want to park that because I've got so much to say. This is, and I'm trying to keep an eye on time, I really am. When the first person walks out, I'll stop talking. Guston talking about Masaccio. He's great talking about those artists on that list. By the way, Giorgio de Chirico, I think, is there, because de Chirico is a kind of gateway for him to that world. He first saw de Chirico's works in Hollywood, at the home of the Aronsbergs. So he saw a couple of de Chirico paintings there. So de Chirico was his way in, as it were, to art history. And I think that's a reason. There's probably lots of other reasons too. That's a reason why de Chirico is on that list. But I really want to focus on the other artists that are there. He talks about Masaccio and he says something an art historian would never be able to say. They're painted like billboards, like sign painting, bing, boom. Now that changed the way I saw Masaccio forever. So I thought, yeah, that's true, isn't it? They are painted like that. They are stark and austere and sharp and tough and uncompromising, and they're not fancy, and they're direct, and they're clumsy. All things that I might easily say about Guston's work too. I think that he found in the past his own ideas, in a way, his own work. Doesn't that look great? I wanted to make sure it looked really great. This is the Scapeni Chapel. This is in Padua. If you haven't been, I can't recommend it more highly. It's one of the most beautiful rooms of painting I've ever seen, I think. And it was all made around 1300 by Giotto di Bondone and his assistants. And it's a room of frescoes. And the frescoes are divided up into more or less square panels, as you can hopefully see here, with this illusionistic frame. So it looks like a room hung with paintings. I think you might see where I'm going with this. It looks like a room hung with paintings. The Sistine Chapel doesn't look like that. This does, I think. And I think, actually, that the 1974 exhibition in BU is deliberately made or installed or hung, and the works are made to evoke chapels, to evoke frescoed spaces. I really think that's the case. Let me show you this. 3 panels, you could say, or 3 sections from Giotto's fresco, which shows Joachim, the father of Virgin Mary. Joachim goes to the temple with his sacrificial lamb, and he's turned away because he hasn't been able to have children, and it's considered a curse. He's considered cursed, so he has to go, and he's pushed away. He goes into the desert, or he goes into the wilderness. There he is in the center. Those are his shepherds, which they're his employees. But I love the fact that the central one does a bit of side-eye when they see him. They're embarrassed. They're embarrassed. He does sacrifice the goat, the little sheep, and on the right-hand side he has a dream, and in Joachim's dream he's visited by an angel, Gabriel probably, who says to him, "You will have a child. You must go see your wife and tell her the good news." The angel has also visited her. Why these? Because something that happens in Giotto's paintings is that your eye gets moved from one to the next, quite a linear way. The chapel is divided into bands of fresco, and they always move in the same direction. It's very, very coherent. The other thing I should say as a sub-note is that Joachim is rejected like Guston was rejected. I mean, look, reading too much into things is my job. So just, I might be wrong. But the whole thing is, Guston was smarting from the bad reviews of the New York show. He didn't really know how people had responded to it during the opening. He left for Italy very soon after that, and he had the reviews sent to him. And he talks about reading the reviews, and he got really angry and upset about them, and then he was in Venice, then he threw them into a canal. He said, forget about it. But I think of course, it was on his mind, I think. And I think this notion, look, it's a small thing, but the notion of a person who's rejected by society must be meaningful to him. The key thing is, how do you create a room full of discrete scenes, separate scenes, that nevertheless cohere? And I think that when you look at Guston's The Hang, you look at the work, they are almost not separate paintings. They're in dialogue with each other. One thing he introduces in this show is the canvas that has an eye, the canvas that can look, the canvas that has agency. It's like it's alive. Now, there's a whole world of artists like Joan Mitchell talking about artwork somehow being alive. And Guston talked about that. He said when he came away from his studio, he said, I left some people in there, like they were alive. It's like a golem. The paintings are alive somehow. This is Dory Ashton writing a fantastic essay in the catalogue of the 1974 show. She says, the eye is clearly Guston's eye, as anyone who knows him will know, but is also the eye of the witness, the ideal spectator, and doesn't blink. The witness, the person who sees out into the world. The eye runs around the entirety of the installation. All of the paintings in this show, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3, which have clan hoods, all of them have eyes that point in the same direction. They always point to the right. And they are eyes that are very like Giotto's eyes. Those eyes seen from the side, quite simplified. It's the same kind of thing. They move around. So there's a sense in which I think all of the paintings are connected in a cycle of paintings, like a fresco chapel. I'll come back to that painter's table a little bit later on. Piero. This is Arezzo. This is how it looks now. It did not look like this in 1970. Piero, as many of you will know, Guston fans will know, that he was an obsession for, not just for Guston, actually, Piero was an obsession for lots of artists of the early 20th century, and he was associated with avant-garde art in the 20s. So that already he was being talked about in relation to Morandi and to Carlo Carra and the great sort of metaphysical painters in northern Italy. So he's already sort of appropriated as a modernist by the time Guston even gets to him. And I think their way of reading his work is quite different to Guston's. I think the works and the content of the works actually mean something and are relevant to Guston too. So this is the legend of the true cross cycle. The legend of the true cross cycle is about the movement of an object. That's what it's about. It's about how an object moves through space and time, and how that object is the motor for a narrative movement. Now, Alfred Hitchcock would call that a MacGuffin. You may have come across that. A MacGuffin is an object that makes the narrative move, like the Maltese falcon in the Maltese Falcon. It doesn't matter what it is. It's sort of meaningless. It just has to be moved around so that the narrative can work. It's the principle of a thriller, but it's there here as well. And the object is the true cross of Jesus Christ. And it goes from one context to another. It's not, the crucifixion isn't there, but one context to another to another. But reading this room, like understanding the story, is very complicated because it's not done in a straightforward linear way as it is with Giotto. It's scrambled. That's not that unusual, but it means that instead of reading it as A, B, C, D narrative, instead you read D in relation to B. You read C in relation to Q. These are all in dialogue with each other. It's a different way of thinking about time, and I think that's a very important aspect of what Guston is doing in 1974. Think how paintings can create a world, but also how paintings can create their own temporal zone. And that's really, really important for him. And I'll show you what I mean. Here are two wonderful frescoes from that chapel by Piero. The Annunciation to the Virgin Mary on the left, and a kind of second Annunciation to the sleeping Emperor Constantine, with the angel coming down to tell him to use the sign of the cross when he goes into battle. Day and night. One historical period, a totally different historical period. But on the same wall, on either side of a window. Day and night. It indicates something about the room that the paintings are in, which is that the room is going to give you an entire day. The room is going to give you all of these different moments in time. And that's kind of what you're presented with the frescoed room. Guston does exactly the same thing in the Boston installation. Day and night. There are some Klansmen still. They've gone more or less entirely by 1974, approximately. Their appearance massively diminishes after the Marlborough show. They appear a little bit. They're doing something different in these paintings, but it's the fact that what you see is the sun rising on the left-hand side and this nighttime scene on the right-hand side. They have a parallel with Piero. Piero is trying to create a whole universe in which you can exist. Let me show you another bit of Piero. Piero was not alive to see this real historical battle take place. It's a 7th century battle. It's a 7th century battle to recover the true cross. It's like something from Indiana Jones. It's a battle. On the right-hand side, the Persian king Khosroes is having his head chopped off at the bottom right corner, and the true cross is underneath that amazing canopy. The battle takes place in contemporary dress. It's medieval armor. It's not ancient 7th century armor. The figures are Western European, they're not Persian, they're Italian faces. This is something we understand to be always the case with artworks produced at this time, that you would deliberately contravene the terms of the story in order to make the story more accessible, alive to an audience that maybe wouldn't understand what the narrative was. But this is a scene of great violence, and yet it's strangely calm and serene. It's a scene of kind of chaos, but it's incredibly organized and orchestrated. Guston, when he was in Rome in 1970, when he was at the American Academy, he went to Arezzo with a group of fellow artists and students. And one of the students saw this part of that fresco and said, "It doesn't look real. If somebody was stabbing you in the neck, wouldn't you scream? If you were stabbing someone in the neck, wouldn't you look like you meant it?" And Guston said, no, you've totally misunderstood this. That's not what this is. This isn't a one-to-one representation of real-life violence. This, he says, this guy with a helmet, he's killing this other man as if he's picking up a piece of grass in the earth or lifting up a button. Like he's an eternal man, eternally stabbing another man, a timeless stabbing. He says it doesn't exist in time. What you're seeing is something that isn't bound by a specific period. It's more to do with something that can be repeated, something that is outside of a specific historical moment. What's it like, I suppose, to look at these things? I'm getting towards the end of this. I've got a few more things I want to show you, if that's okay. This is the finding of the true cross towards the end. They've discovered it, the cross of Christ and the cross of the thieves. They've unearthed it. They've excavated it. They found it. This is St. Helena, Constantine's mother, with the conical hat on. And look at what they do. Look at how they feel when they get it out of the earth. It should be the most exciting day of their lives. Everyone looks depressed, or they look abstracted. They look as though they're not really focusing. And that's a particular Piero kind of face, which is a face that's somehow disengaged from it. It's as though the story detaches itself from the specifics of what it's telling you to be something else. It's both a depiction of this particular scene and something that is outside of it, that's maybe commenting on it or thinking about it. And the look, I say depressed, what I really mean is melancholy. And this is kind of where I get to a couple more things that I want to show you. When I came to Boston in 2022, I went to the MFA and looked at lots of things. And one of the things I found was this absolutely amazing painting, which is from Alsace. So it's why it's called Alsatian. It wasn't painted by a dog. It's called Christ as the Man of Sorrows, made around you can see it really, hopefully, quite well on that screen. Made around 1470. And it's a really odd painting, iconographically, because you've got Jesus Christ sitting on the hill on which he was crucified on Golgotha. The cross is behind him, and the instruments of the Passion that he's beaten and tortured with are around him. And he sits with his head in his hand in the classic pose of melancholy, which I don't have an image of it here, but you'll know maybe from the famous image by Albrecht Dürer, which of course Guston knew really well, in fact, had a reproduction of it on his kitchen wall for almost the whole of his life, so he'd see it all the time. That's very unusual, to show Christ in that way, to show him melancholy, and the objects around it feel very large, I think, and intimidatingly heavy. The nails, I don't know how well you can see this, maybe on the side screens you can. The nails that are on top are actually not attached to the cross. They are floating on top of it. They're not actually in the cross, because he's not on the cross anymore. They had to take them out in order to get him down from the cross. And those nails are remarkably similar in position to the nail in Painter's Table on the right-hand side. I'm not, again, just trying to say he looked at that and therefore this, because that's not what this is. But I think this idea of what objects can do in paintings, how objects can contain a kind of mysterious weight, and a weight that can only be contemplated in a melancholy way, that's what we see in this one. I mean, the Painter's Table, it seems to me, divides up in terms of these two layers. The top layer has got these irons. So he had a collection that's still in the studio in Woodstock, this collection of 19th or early 20th century irons and of these nails, railroad spikes, these really fantastic industrial American iron and steel objects. But the bottom level is, if there's a blue-collar or industrial life expressed by those objects, the objects at the lower level is all bohemia. It's smoking, it's painting, it's reading. It's the life of the mind. I mean, again, I don't want to read this in too obvious or binary a way, but I think Guston is thinking about those objects and how those objects can speak about a life that's otherwise not represented there. Painting, smoking, eating. Painting, smoking, eating. That's the name of a painting by Guston. That's the name of Guston's practice too, in a way. That's a way of naming what he was up to. This is Giotto again. To bring this to an end, Giotto. The Bardi Chapel in Florence was not damaged in the 1966 flood because it's quite high, but it is damaged. That's there. Let me use the little pointer, actually, maybe. Should use that before. It's there. And it's a cycle, it's a beautiful cycle of fresco paintings by Giotto, a little bit after the Scapens Chapel, which show the life of St. Francis. The church is dedicated to Francis, Franciscan church, like the Piero is. Francis has died, he's on his deathbed, and he is surrounded by his followers, the Franciscan monks. And his soul ascends to heaven, up there. But this shape around it, the reason why that's there is that in the, I think maybe 17th century, when taste changed, it was whitewashed over, painted over with new fresco, and a tomb was placed on top of that wall. In the 20th century, or maybe late 19th, when Giotto was sort of, quote, rediscovered, they removed that fresco and they removed the tomb, and what happened was the wall got pulled away as part of that. I mean, that, I think, is kind of interesting because something happens to the painting, seems to me. The soul of Francis is outside of the frame now. What we see instead is Francis on his deathbed surrounded by these weeping, mourning monks. He's in his bed. He's being surrounded by things, objects, a heap, a pile, a mound of people. But here on the right-hand side, painter in bed, objects that float above him and objects that press down on his chest so he can't get out of bed. These figures, with this cyclops-like eye and the head maybe the shape of a bean, people sometimes say, or a kidney, this sort of strange shape, or like a palette in some ways too. He identified it as a self-portrait, the painter in bed. He can't get up. The tools of his trade are weighing him down, and he can just sit in bed and smoke. And while he's sitting in bed and smoking, things happen in the air above his head. What is he visited by? He's visited by disembodied objects, disembodied feet, shoes, things that have a great and powerful resonance when you consider the photographs of the concentration camps, which he was very familiar with the piles of shoes. So that is a lot to put into one painting, because it's both absurdist, comic, deeply tragic at the same time. I think that this engagement with the art of the past, specifically these Italian artists, is in part supported by his engagement with Boston and with Boston artists, with the traditions of Boston University, with its focus on life drawing, but also more broadly and maybe more importantly, with his way of thinking about his own identity. How does one explore or articulate that within a figurative idiom? In 1977, Guston made a statement which is constantly quoted. He's being interviewed by the New York Post, really interestingly enough. What kind of man am I? He says. Sitting at home, reading magazines, going into a frustrated fury about everything, and then going home to adjust a red to a blue. How, in other words, do I square my life as an engaged and active person who is aware of the politics of his time, who sees what's taking place, and the list is sort of, you can enumerate a very long list of what he is reading in those magazines, what he's seeing on TV, lots of different things. He can't square that person with the person who goes into the studio, shuts the door, and makes abstract paintings. And yet, I don't think he ever actually resolved it. I think that question is something that is active in his work. I don't think he did resolve it. I don't think he did find a way to connect those two parts of his life. I think the fact he didn't resolve it is what makes the paintings interesting. The fact he didn't resolve it is what energizes the drama of the paintings of the artist in bed. In the 1974 show, these images, there are 4 big paintings of the artist in bed, are punctuated in the space. It's like a chorus. You keep going back to it. The painter in bed. Chips, as I would call them, French fries, cigarettes, slices of cake, booze, all of the things that are keeping him from painting, they're in there, the temptations are there. But what's happening too while he does that is that the past comes back in. The past suddenly appears. And the past, that top left one, is called painting, smoking, eating. The top left one, the past is like a weight that is pressing him down into his bed. I think these paintings ask that question, what kind of a man am I, without answering it. And that is, I think, where I have to stop. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was so wonderful. I mean, I think we'll at least have a short conversation since people are here. If you need to leave, you can go. But I feel like you brought up.
I may have gone on too long.
So no, you didn't. I went on too long at the beginning.
Okay.
You brought up so many really interesting points that, I mean, some of the phrases that you said about kind of dragging this kind of clay forward from his past.
Yeah.
And then kind of also the quote about these paintings are kind of making themselves, this story that he's telling. I wonder if, I probably want to ask a question about, you're thinking about his teaching and that context of Boston in relation to being a faculty member, because we have students here and because we have alums who study with Boston. But do you feel like the kind of sense of having to speak through this work, telling these stories all the time in the studio, was something that also, I mean, he goes to Italy, and he comes back and tells the stories in his work, but he's also simultaneously telling, as I'm understanding from having talked to alums, telling about those paintings to the students. So there's multiple narrations going on.
Definitely. You know what, we're illustrating it now, because I feel that looking at his, there's a wonderful book of the collected, edited by Clark Coolidge, the collected lectures and talks by, which many artists that I know, they have it in their studio and it's covered in paint. It was like a Bible. His ideal, I think, situation was a dialogue. Because in a dialogue, whether it's with Joseph Abloh here in '66 or whether it's with Harold Rosenberg, also here in 1974, in a dialogue he can keep changing his mind and he's got something to butt up against. He's got an interlocutor. And I think that idea of conversation and a friction, which is in his paintings, is something that he valued, and it's something I think he would absolutely have got from teaching, but also of having that kind of contact with people like Abloh or Aronson or others. So I think dialogue, the idea of dialogue, even though it's funny in a way, isn't it? Because his work does feel quite like whatever the adjective, like monologue-like, because it's very much about him. But nevertheless, I do think that actually the dialogue is the kind of way in which his work gets energized, because it's always contradictory. It's always living in contradiction.
And it seems like that's something that people talk about in his lectures and his conversations, is this kind of tension back and forth between that. Yeah,
and we want maybe, I don't know, we want our artists to maybe, their work to be about one thing. Like, this is what my work is about. When you look at him as an example, he's constantly changing his mind about what his work was about. He said, I don't know, there's a great line. He's talking about a painting of a shoe. It looks like a shoe, and he says, I don't know what the hell it is.
What's funny?
So what isn't that shoe? But no, it's not really a shoe, because everything is, there's a great line, somebody said it might have been Robert Slifkin. He said the forms are promiscuous in Guston. They're like always, they're more, they're always more. The shoe is also a head, and it's also lots of other things.
Well, that was my experience with that painting in particular, standing there in London with it. I just sat with it for a really long time and drew it, because I was like, I just kind of have to stay with one piece, because they're all so much. But I wanted to kind of have that experience of looking at what things turn into as you're looking at them. That kind of, and that sense of the weight of those fries, those chips, they also look like boards.
They
so
do.
Many different things.
Everything is also something else at the same time, I think.
Like
and that's something that we might not always associate with figurative painting, but for him that was really important, that kind of, something could always become something else. And when he talked about Piero, and he said what he loved about Piero is that there's always the possibility of another painting. You see a Piero and you say it's somehow not complete. It's going to suggest something else. So that's what he wanted his work to have too. He said the ideal painting is one which suggests another painting. It keeps generating things. And you literally see that happening because there's the most amazing photographs of Guston that were taken for Dory Ashton's book, taken by Denise Hare.
Oh, yeah.
Great, I love those photographs. And you can see the studio in Woodstock, this is in 1976, 75, is absolutely full of paintings that haven't sold. Like, this is just like a basic thing.
Stretched, right? They're on these racks.
Yes, they're on these racks. There's loads of them. And you see these photographs, you go, my God, that one's in Fort Worth now, that one's in the Pompidou now, that one's in the Tate now. But you go, no, the work, the unsold work is activated in the paintings, because in the paintings, other paintings then appear, and then they become golems, actually. They become things that can be repurposed and, made new.
I'm thinking, because you're talking about dialogue too, I want to open this up for, and just help moderate their audience questions or observations or things that, people who knew Guston want to bring to the conversation.
Or not,
Or not, or questions.
Oh.
What was he like as a teacher to you?
Okay, so the question is, shall I repeat the question so everyone can hear it? What was he like as a teacher at BU? Which is the question that I want to know the answer to as well. So would anybody like to?
Bruce, do you want to, you helped me prepare when I was speaking in London, so you can introduce yourself.
I was just going to say, thank you very much, Ben. That was excellent.
Thank you.
You evoked, in a really good way, Phil's presence. The thing that I think that he would turn over in his grave about is if people start trying to decode his work. I remember seeing this show, the BU show, and I was a young, naive student and thought, I just want to learn how to draw well. Mm-hmm. And I see this being held up for me as an example, and I said, this guy doesn't know how to draw.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't even know what a shoe is.
Exactly.
But I mean, he had a big impact on everybody here.
Yeah.
In a sense, discovering painting again. And you felt like when you were talking with Phil and he was telling you his many, many stories, that you were living in those stories. So I think he was really incredibly hospitable.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's a lovely word to use, isn't it? Yeah.
I feel like that was kind of what seemed to come across. Yes, Sydney?
Yeah, there are a couple of, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
I have a lot of stories about Philip, but one thing that struck me, that exhibition after the Marlborough, I was sort of in charge of the gallery at that time, and I think I've told you the story, but I went to New York to look at the show shortly after it opened, and in order to see how many pieces we could put into the 855 gallery. And I walked, it was a Monday when the gallery was closed, and I walked in right off the elevator into the gallery, and there was Philip sitting on a bench facing me, and I looked at the show. I hadn't seen the work. And I looked at Phil, and he said, "You still want to do the show?" He was genuinely, this was after the Kramer review, he was genuinely upset about what happened. But I remember when he got that honorary degree, there was a dinner afterwards at a restaurant over near Charles River French restaurant, and we were all sitting at the table, and no one had seen any of this work. To us, the most recent work that Guston had been doing were these very lyrical abstractions. And someone asked him what he was working on, and he said, "I can't really tell you, but I hope that when it's shown, it will influence younger artists." And I think that came true.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
But there were so many instances of his always questioning as you said, always leaving things open as to what things really mean.
Thank you
He
for
was an
sharing.
impressive character.
Well, you made him feel like a prince.
Yeah, there you go. Could have, no, I'm sure it was. Yeah, this idea, say that when we say, this it could be ambiguous, could become something else, it's something we would associate with an abstract painting, but it's very interesting that he's working a figurative idiom, but still making it be ambiguous and be something. I love that thing about decoding, by the way, it's great. Because I think that's anathema as well, I think, to his work for me. That's not what they invite us to do at all. That's the pleasure of it, I think.
I really appreciated that point. Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
go ahead, Joe.
I had Guston as a teacher at Brandeis in 1965, before he came to BU. But I was struck when you were showing the work of other Boston artists, the Hyman Bloom and the Zerba, that those paintings resonated with me as like his early work from the, whatever, the 40s or so. Like, they hadn't moved beyond that, and he was looking to find a way out of that genre. So I could imagine that they were very meaningful to him, but also he was very dissatisfied in 1965 with what he was doing, which was I think the gray and black heads shapes.
Yeah, definitely. That's fascinating.
Did he talk about that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Did he talk about that with the
He had a
students?
show at Brandeis at the
Yeah.
Rose Museum back then.
But
And all I remember, I don't remember a lot about what was said, but he would look at my paintings, because I was in his class, and he'd say, "You need more pink."
Oh, great.
That is great. I think, you good?
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, yeah, we have somebody at the back.
I'm going to try to be brave and tell my story, since
Right.
I tell it to all my friends. So I studied with Philip Guston at BU, and when he used to come around to the studios as a visiting professor, and there'd be a whole fuss and buzz about it, and we'd all stand our paintings up around our studio, and he would come in and watch, and other students would follow along and watch as well. And of course, he was always smoking. So one year for his birthday, I knew it was his birthday in June, and I decided to make a little painting for him and send it to him. So I made a painting of him from the back, standing with a cigarette, looking at all the paintings, and there were cigarette butts all over the floor and the smoke in the air, and I mailed it to him. And I got the most wonderful letter saying, when my wife and I opened your package, I yelped with joy. It was so there, everything, the cigarettes, the smoke. And he said, I have several letters that I cherish. He said, you see the world as I do, both droll and funny. And he sent me a beautiful drawing, which is a poster for one of his shows, that he signed. And that's my prized possession. And recently I had to explain to our 2 grown kids, if we die, don't sell that at a yard sale.
That's great.
Oh, isn't that great? Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. Do you want to get the mic? Yeah.
I'll just speak very loudly. But I want to ask about your thesis and why
Yeah.
you picked this artist and what stood out to you. I mean,
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I first saw Guston's work in print, in The Shock of the New by Robert Hughes, where he actually writes about the experience of giving him a terrible review and then coming round. That's a rarity for a critic, actually, to say I was wrong. And he comes around to it. I saw them in reproduction and thought, wow, those are really, I don't know what that is. Anyway, I was probably about 14. In 2004, there's a big retrospective of Guston that came to London. I was a relatively recent graduate, and I was taken by a friend who's a painter. He said, "You've got to see this." I said, "Oh, yeah, I think I recognize this guy." And the thing I was struck by when I saw Guston's paintings for the first time was how big they were. Like, it sounds very minor, because that's not what people really talk about. But I thought, wow, these are huge. I saw them on the page and thought, oh, they're pretty about this big. They look like cartoons. They might almost be the size of a cartoon, but they weren't the size of a cartoon. They're the size of like a big, they're almost the size of a Pollock. They're huge, right? Or a big Pollock, yeah. So I was really struck by that. And then, the years went by. I'm not going to do the whole thing. But Guston stayed with me as somebody I would reread Night Studio, the book by his daughter, which is an absolutely beautiful book. And it's clear-eyed. It's not romantic. It's great. And then I just read everything I could find about him. And then I started as a painter. I'm not a painter anymore, but as they say, some of my best friends are painters. And you end up, if you speak to somebody who's a painter, Guston comes up in conversation, at least in my experience. I say, oh, yeah, we talk about it. And so it was, and I think actually really the reason why I did it about Guston was that he stayed in my mind. I do a lot of writing about contemporary painting, so I was quite connected to what artists were doing, and they were clearly looking at Guston, and there was lots of figuration, and I thought it feels like there's it's not that it's relevant, that there's a kind of currency to Guston in painting of the last decade, maybe, in lots of different places, not just in the UK. And the last thing really was I felt that, that painting called Pantheon, it was like this riddle or puzzle, because I kept going back to going, what is that? What is that thing? Because why does this painting that looks nothing like the work of any of those artists, except maybe to Chirico? It doesn't look like Giotto, Masaccio, Piero, or Tiepolo, and yet it seems to be a kind of mission statement. It seems to be a way of saying, the title says that, here are my heroes, this is my Pantheon. And I thought, what is going on with that relationship? So that was the I couldn't say, I don't think it is a mystery, because I don't think it's crackable. But I do think it's like a route. It's a route for me. It's a route into the work, to understand what the work was doing. I worked as a teacher, you can probably tell, for a very long time as a teacher of art history, which meant that I had to teach lots of different things, and I had to become a kind of generalist. But Guston was kind of a generalist too. And so I thought, well, his way of picking up on lots of different kinds of things reflects my own attitude towards art history, which I don't recognize its boundaries. I don't recognize historical boundaries in the same kind of way. I like things to be in dialogue with each other. So that's a kind of long answer, but I spent a long time writing this thing. It's huge, like I say, but I got to the end and thought, oh no, I think I've just started, actually. I got to the end and thought, oh, no, there's loads more that I haven't thought about. And it's tremendous. Many of you will know, it's so nourishing. There are some artists who are so nourishing. I don't know if all of them are, but I find him very nourishing, because I go back to his work all the time, and I see other artists work through him, and I see contemporary painters, I go, oh, there's a Guston thing happening, and it's just continually enlivening and enjoyable and nourishing, and that's why. And that's unusual. I didn't do it to further my own, I didn't do it because I thought it would be a sort of, savvy move academically. I did it because I want to spend time with this artist's work. It's a love thing. And that's not very academic, but that's just the way it is.
I think that's a perfect ending, too, because we really feel that in your lecture tonight, in your correspondence, and in reading your dissertation. And it's just, thank you so much for sharing the roots of the roots.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. Talk about it a little further.
Yeah, absolutely.